Hey Detoxers, welcome to a special episode of the Disinfo Detox. This is a crossover episode with the Cultural Studies Podcast. I'm Nolan Higdon, the host of the Disinfo Detox, and today I'm going to hand over the hosting chair to the host of the Cultural Studies Podcast, Toby Miller. Welcome.
Thanks a lot, Nolan. Great to see you, and great to see others. And the others are Robin Andersen and Steve Masek. And this is this the third or the fourth time we've gotten together for the Cultural Studies podcast? And we're carrying on, it says four, says Robin. Yeah. We're carrying on a conversation that so far has brought down the Trump administration, upended the Democrats, installed a new Muslim Marxist mayor of, oh no, sorry, hasn't done any of those things. So what have we achieved so far, guys? Let me know. Robin, tell us what's happening.
Well, I find, our discussions are so interesting. And now I think we're in this kind of monumental global contest of fighting on so many different levels. Some of them are about life and death, but on cultural levels, on political levels, the world just seems to be in a massive upheaval, and the forces are, if this was an action adventure movie, it would be good against evil. But since we're a intellectual podcast, we have to talk about diversity and culture and the cultural realm, the move to authoritarian kind of an image, a terrible nostalgic image of an America that never was, against the forces of progress, and there's just on so many different levels, not to mention the Middle East, not to mention Israel today bombed Doha in yet another very provocative breach of international law, where Israel is now, in the last 24 hours, bombed 4 different countries. The globe seems to be really, I don't know, I don't want to say coming apart, but we're in an epic battle.
Steve Masek, are there any resources of hope, or am I asking you to do the impossible?
You might be asking the wrong person, because I'm located in Chicago, where Donald Trump has just, announced, or the Trump administration has just announced Operation Midway Blitz. ICE agents are in the process of rounding up people. They're on the streets of Chicago. We know they're visiting various different locations. And this comes after, over the weekend, Donald Trump sent out a social media post on his social media platform, where he said that the city of Chicago is going to understand why they're calling what used to be called the Department of Defense the Department of War, implicitly threatening to wage war against the city of Chicago, an American city full of mostly American citizens. And he posted that together with an AI generated image from that made reference to Apocalypse Now, where Donald Trump was dressed up like Robert Duvall from Apocalypse Now, the deranged lieutenant who says, "I love the smell of napalm in the morning." And he had a little slogan that said, and Trump said, I love the smell of deportation. And he had a little title over this AI generated image that said "Shypocalypse Now." He was implicitly threatening violence against the entire city of Chicago. We are all terrified that he might try to send in the National Guard the way that he did in LA. On the thinnest of pretexts, right? Claiming that there's some sort of state of emergency in the city of Chicago, which is ridiculous because it's full of tourists wandering around Millennium Park and crime rates are at like a 30-year low. So are there resources of hope? What gives me hope is that over the weekend there was a massive demonstration in Chicago protesting Trump's threats and also the deployment of ICE. There is an emergency demonstration today, which right in the center of the Loop in downtown Chicago, which I imagine is going to attract thousands of people. Everybody here, from the governor of the state of Illinois to the mayor, to ordinary people, the labor movement, immigrant rights groups. They're all mobilizing. So that gives me a little bit of hope. But no, otherwise, I think these 4 podcasts that we had together like perfectly chart America's descent into fascism, right? I think we went back to the first time we had this conversation. We were all worrying about fascism, and now it has arrived. We're here.
It's here. I think I get what you're saying, Stephen. I didn't know about that artificial intelligence. I wouldn't say artificial insemination. That artificial intelligence meme posted by the orange comb over that you mentioned. It is truly shocking. And yet it's in keeping with the desire to disenfranchise as many citizens as possible, and specifically to decouple any city or state that votes Democrat from politics. Now, Nolan, you're in California, which is one of the so-called blue states. For all that all of us here would be very critical of the Democratic Party, it's clear that it, amongst other things, is in Trump's sights because it is some sort of opposition to him. I wonder if you'd comment a bit on that.
As far as California goes, I think California has really established itself, at least in the imagination of a lot of liberals, as kind of the resistance state in a lot of ways. I think Gavin Newsom has played a critical role in trying to amplify that image. I think for the Trump administration, I mean, California is really kind of the personification of everything he's trying to stand against, whether it be the massive immigration policy, whether it be the unwavering support for DEI, a long tradition of celebrating protests and higher education. I think a lot of these things are antithetical to the Trump administration. And I think that's why he targets it, the state. Also, and this may be a little more personal, this is kind of a little conjecture on my part, but Trump also is a television president. He is a product of the television age in a lot of ways and really sees things through a television lens. I mean, I think listeners will recall when Zelensky was in the White House, Trump let the reporters in and he said, I knew this was going to be good television. I mean, that is something he thinks about in decision making. And so much of entertainment is made in Los Angeles. And I think there's a whole culture there that Trump has been associated with. And a lot of people talk about his desire to be a part of that culture and really not kind of welcomed, I think, as much as he wanted to. And I also wonder if that sometimes plays a role in his disdain for like Los Angeles and Hollywood and that whole era. He feels like a guy on the outside.
Well, speaking of Hollywood, I'm sure Trump had a big hand in the military and West Point rescinding the award that they were going to give to Tom Hanks. It's given by the alumni organization, and it's to a civilian who has done a lot for the military. And certainly, Tom Hanks has supported veterans services, not to mention his roles and everything, Band of Brothers and all of the way that he has promoted the military. But Trump, he can't seem to stop himself. He has such a thin skin. Some people pointed out to the Saturday Night Live skit that Tom Hanks did. I don't know if you saw it, but it was actually very funny. It was Saturday Night Live where they're doing Black Jeopardy, and Tom Hanks is playing a MAGA supporter, and he's got the silly hat on, and he's very funny the way he's talking and stuff. But they find common ground. There are these 2 Black women, and then him, and they're asking him these questions, and he comes up with some of the best answers, like that kind of feed into a kind of a Black critical culture of like mainstream, liberalism. And he goes, well, yeah, now I believe that, right? And they're going, whoa, dude. And so, but Trump just couldn't stand that, and many are pointing that could have been it. But well, no wonder he's so disdained, because he's on the attack, and then he's kind of whining like a victim. It's odd.
I'm interested in how this is playing out in the tensions between domestic and foreign policy. Steve's already pointed out some of the horrendous authoritarian tendencies that you witness in all sorts of safe cities for migrants and the targeting of Chicago. But before we started recording, we were discussing Venezuela and how it's currently a target. I live, and I'm speaking to you from Guadalajara in Mexico, which, as you know, is one of the places that Donald J. Trump is threatening to send the military to. Now, on the one hand, there is the Make America Great Again sentiment that is against foreign involvement, foreign wars, etc. On the other, there is this obsession with drugs that seems to be compelling at least part of this new intervention, although, of course, there's also the intervention on behalf of Israel. So I wondered if there's a way in which we could talk about some of the potential contradictions emerging within the Republican Party over these foreign wars. Any views on that?
Well, I'll just speak to what's happening with Venezuela, which I think is kind of interesting. I know Robin has a lot to say about the U.S. support for Israel's war on Gaza, but we just saw the U.S. use military force to blow up a Venezuelan vessel that was, that the State Department and the U.S. government claimed was involved in drug trafficking, killing a bunch of civilians. We don't know. I mean, it could well be that the people who were on that boat were transporting, illegal drugs that were intended to be ultimately, shipped to the United States. We don't know. But what was interesting, some of you may have heard about this, but there was a social media exchange that took place where J.D. Vance, the vice president of the United States, said, "This is the best use of our military force, right? To kill the scum who are importing drugs into the United States." And somebody responded that this is actually doing this without due process to civilians is actually a war crime. And he said, "I don't give a fuck, or I don't give a shit what you call it." Right? Basically saying he doesn't care whether the U.S. is committing war crimes if it's stopping the importation of drugs. Why this is, I think, concerning is that Ken Klippenstein, former Intercept reporter who now is sort of an independent reporter, has just reported today that the U.S. government is actively planning military strikes on Venezuela as part of this global war on the narcotics trade. He's citing actual memos that are they're probably contingency plans. They're not definite plans. We don't know if they were definite plans, they would have been shared like on Substack or something, right? But or on YouTube. But in any case, that's incredibly alarming because it is a kind of level of international aggression that we haven't yet seen from the Trump administration. They prefer to have proxies do their dirty business, dirty work. And so I think it would be a terrifying escalation.
And I think it's worth noting, if we go back to the days of Plan Colombia and the vast militarization of that country under the sign of huge amounts of US money dedicated to intersections between the Colombian and the US military, but also to, removing the scourge of cultivation and marketing and transportation of cocaine, achieved literally nothing. I mean, absolutely nothing. The only economic benefit to Colombia is that now the Colombian military sells services in how to militarize countries to other nation states based on what it learned from the United States. And here, of course, in Mexico, the increased militarization of everyday life over the last 10 to 15 years, done in the name of combating narcotraficantes, has also achieved, to use the technical language of feminism, diddly squat. But moving on to Gaza, we're almost at the 69th anniversary of the French-Israeli-British conspiracy to invade the Suez Canal and to take it back from Nasser. When Israel turned on its allies in the UN and admitted that it wasn't at war with Egypt, and that therefore the French and British offered to become peacekeepers to decelerate tension. That was a sign that the Israelis were going to wage a different kind of war. They went straight into Gaza and they machine gunned every male Palestinian they could find. So I want to make the point that we're echoing something that's gone on not only in 1948, consistently ever since, and very spectacularly in 56. Anyway, Robin, you're an expert on these matters. I wondered if you'd like to wade in here.
I think we're currently living now with Trump in the White House and all of the militarization, um, the emphasis on drugs, everything we've been talking about. We're living through this legacy of the Biden administration. Certainly, Toby, it goes back to the history that you're talking about. But but the Biden administration was so intent on supporting Israel's genocide and this model of of global military dominance with 800 military bases around the globe and Israel as this important client state in the Middle East, and as a settler colony, that they pushed it through. They would rather have handed over the American democracy to this Trump person, um, instead of stopping what was happening in Gaza. I think we're finally seeing, just because it's really now clearly starvation and extermination, and there's finally some pushback. Far too late, I think, to save certainly most of the children in a generation in Gaza. But it's nevertheless significant that we seem now in America, the rest of the globe seems to be coming to its senses, so many parts of the globe. If we think about Spain, for example, it announced that it's closed off all of its airspace and also is blocking any Israeli military going through their ports. We've got actually some significant pushback in the Congress, where the last vote to block aid, the majority of the Democrats in the House actually voted for the Bernie Sanders bill to block all the offensive aid going to Israel. That was big. Recently, we've got Jeff Merkley and Chris Van Hollen, Democrats from Oregon and Maryland, going to Israel, trying to get, even just see some flyover shots of Gaza, trying to get into Gaza, and having this riveting story, having their story told on social media, of course, not on mainstream media, hardly a peep. But they're saying the Israelis won't let us do anything, and they're just sitting here telling us we're having to listen to their propaganda, and they're calling it lies and they're calling it propaganda. And they're telling this on social media. There's a number of different things. The United Nations is also in this moment of, if people, it's its 80th anniversary. It has proven actually incapable of stopping a genocide, primarily because of these no votes by the U.S. and Israel. There has to be a way. And there have been many proposals where the Security Council could simply put a convoy in, and they could actually stop the rest of this genocide. But many thought that the New York 80th General Assembly that is convening, pretty much now, should be taking place in Geneva, because the Trump administration has taken out the visas, has blocked the visas of all of the Palestinian delegates, including the PLO. So there's not going to be any kind of really meaningful dialogue, even now. But I think the in terms of global protest and people against the machinery of war, which I think it seems an impossible David and Goliath scenario, but there is an awful lot of people on this globe, and there are very few that have the money and the power and the military. Then they're wielding it, and that is what I mean about this particular moment. But I think the most kind of symbolic thing for me is to see all these boats on the Mediterranean heading toward Gaza. This Freedom Flotilla, the Sumud, which has got it's um, 50 boats from 44 nations, and they're heading to Gaza. And Meanwhile, you've got the dock workers in Genoa saying that if they lose contact with them, if Israel attacks them or boards the boats, that they're going to block all of European ports if they're even losing contact for 20 minutes. I mean, this is big. I mean, this is all of these things show that we're in a fight. Um, we're in a fight for humanity, particularly, and against the militarism that this drug boat diplomacy and this war on drugs is all a part of. We're in a huge.
Now, one of the main issues that feeds into this and comes out of it that you touch on, Robin, is sources of information. I want to turn to you, Nolan. Here we are in the Disinfo Detox world. How is it that there are longshoremen, that there are waitresses, there are secretaries, there are CEOs in many parts of the world who've got some appreciation of what's actually going on here, when there is such a bourgeois media, basically propaganda regime in place? Well, where are the places that you encourage your students, your listeners, your viewers, your family members, your loved ones to go to get hold of, John Lennon said it, just give me some truth?
Yeah, it's a fabulous question, and to add context into answering it, and this kind of builds on what Robin was saying. Certainly, we're getting more and more polling out about how people in the United States actually feel, and it's becoming increasingly obvious that a substantial portion, in some cases a majority, depending on how the question is asked, are opposed to the United States' support of Israel. They do feel pain for the plight of the Gazans. They do support two-state solutions. A lot of things that directly contradict the narrative of U.S. media is the agreed-upon position of most Americans. So I think that that's an important element to add here, because the media system has largely ignored it. And back to Robin's point about this being the legacy of Biden, um, during the Biden years, Democrats took great comfort in the fact the legacy media protected them from any questions about Gaza. Trump and Republicans did go into the digital media space and, of course, lied, but made it, at least plausible that they were going to end the war. They were willing to go in the space and hint at things like that. I mean, those of us who pay attention to politics and media knew that it was bullshit from the start, but it was something that gave some folks hope, and some folks were willing to take a crack at the Trump administration. Now you see Democrats realizing that they have to enter this digital media space. This is where people are at. And when they enter this space, they're really caught off guard by the fact that people just openly refer to what's going on in Gaza as a genocide. It's not even up for debate in a lot of these podcasts, because it was debated a year and a half ago for a lot of these spaces. And Democrats have looked pretty dismal, to say the least. I mean, Alyssa Slotkin got embarrassed on breaking points when her own previous statements were used against her. Richie Torres, looked like a total vapid identitarian when he went on like the Adam Friedland show. And you can go on and on. Pete Buttigieg on Pod Save America, and Pod Save America is made to support Democrats in the digital space, and Buttigieg wrestled with Israel on that show. So I think a lot of Democrats are starting to wake up to the fact that there is nowhere to hide. But of course, they're stuck between this age-old rock and a hard place for Democrats, between doing what's morally right and what their base wants and what their donors want, the people who pay the money for them to exist. And I think that's the critical difference. But I will say that some folks in media have actually realized this. I know it wasn't really popular, but I'm blanking on her name, but Clarissa from CNN, she did a video where she was walking down the street talking about how she knew the media was not covering this story correctly, and that there are people inside CNN and the mainstream press who are lobbying to get a more kind of fair picture painted of this war, and they're getting pushed back. Megyn Kelly kind of said something to the same effect. I know these are not good actors. These are folks from corporate media, but the very fact they're at least feeling like they have to say it, I think points to the fact that they know the public is starting to smell the BS here. So I take some confidence in that. As far as recommended sources, and I've said this before, and I think it's really weird, but like, I think Haaretz does some of like the best reporting. It's an Israeli publication, but I found it a lot more useful than a lot of U.S. Mainstream publications. Of course, I think Al Jazeera does some great stuff in there. I think independent journalists, particularly like Mint Press News and others, do some great work in these spaces. So I would clearly recommend that. And then, of course, we'd be remiss we didn't say, because they're on the call. I mean, Robin Andersen has done a great job, and way before it was a lot more inviting to talk about these things. A year plus ago, Robin was saying these exact same critiques to basically an audience that didn't want to listen to Robin. Now I think more folks are listening, but Robin has really been on this since the beginning. So I would also encourage folks to follow Robin Andersen's work.
I think the CNN reporter you're referring to was Clarissa Ward.
Clarissa Ward, yes, there we go.
Yeah, yeah. And I couldn't agree more about Robin's work, and not only on this topic, but on so many, over so many decades. Young though she be. Steve, I wanted to turn to you, if I could, to ask how the media in Chicago, a famous media town, are covering this assault on the city.
No, that's a great question. So, in Chicago is still a two newspaper town. There aren't very many of them right around the United States anymore. This is why we have a problem in this country with growing news deserts, because even large cities like, say, Philadelphia have just one daily newspaper. And as much as I like and support and fund without out of my own money independent news outlets, they simply don't have the resources of the larger legacy news organizations, right? No small publication like Mint Press News can afford to hire like 200 an army of 200 reporters, and nor can they afford to stand up to libel lawsuits and so on. They just don't have the deep pockets that the big corporate media have. So we have we have two daily newspapers here. We have the Chicago Tribune and the Chicago Sun-Times. The Chicago Tribune is traditionally a Republican-leaning paper and serves the suburbs, and the Chicago Sun-Times is a much more sort of democratic, more working-class paper. Both papers almost went bankrupt during the pandemic. Both both entered into bankruptcy proceedings, but they almost both went out of business. The Chicago Sun-Times was bought by Chicago Public Media, which operates our public radio station here, and so technically the Chicago Sun-Times is part of the WBEZ, which is our NPR affiliate, which is now no longer funded at all by the U.S. government because Donald Trump slashed all funding for public media. The Chicago Sun-Times has been kind of relentless in covering this story. And I think the Chicago Tribune has also, because the Sun-Times and other local media outlets like the broadcast television news stations, we have two Spanish language broadcast news stations in Chicago, because they've been covering ISIS kidnapping of seizing of people from the streets, their various sweeps, which didn't just start this past weekend. They've been here for a few months, but they've picked up the rate at which they're rounding people up and taking people off the streets. They have been reporting on this. They've been tracking it very carefully because the people in their audience know that it's happening in their neighborhoods, right? They can't deny reality. And not only that, but I think given the way that Donald Trump has been talking about Chicago as if it is as if it's just this blood-drenched killing field, it clearly that clearly does not jive with most people's everyday experience. Yes, in certain neighborhoods in Chicago, certain poor, predominantly African American neighborhoods on the South and West Side, there is horrific levels of gun violence. Nobody is going to deny that. But Chicago doesn't even have it isn't even in the top 10 in terms of the violent crime in the United States. And if Donald Trump really wanted to clean up crime, I mean, first of all, sending troops is not a way not a way to address violent crime. It's a violation of the Posse Comitatus Act, right? The Posse Comitatus Act says very clearly you cannot use the U.S. military to enforce laws, and that's what he's been threatening to do. It wouldn't really address the crime problem anyway. But if he really wanted to address the crime problem by deploying U.S. troops, he would be sending them to Louisiana and Mississippi and places like that, where violent crime is much worse than it is in Chicago. So I think that the media, to get back to your question, I think local media has been reporting very critically on especially Trump's anti-Chicago rhetoric, and they have been fairly sympathetic to. I think the local media is very critical of our mayor, Brandon Johnson, who is he's a Democratic socialist. They've been very critical of some of his policies, but they are rallying behind him in his conflict with Donald Trump, interestingly. And I think they've also been very sympathetic to Pritzker and Pritzker's, pushing back at some of the wild, just completely unfounded, deranged claims that are coming out of the White House about Illinois and Chicago.
And it's interesting that two of the governors we've mentioned, Pritzker and Newsom, are potentially using some of this as capital, in both senses of the term, for potential presidential runs. Robin, I saw you sort of biting your bottom lip a moment ago. I get the sense you want to leap in.
I did. I think a lower court ruled that the immigration raids in Los Angeles were illegal and they were in violation of the Constitution. Am I wrong about thinking that the Supreme Court then rolled that back at the higher level? So here we see the courts have been doing, a really good job. Public Citizen has really been taking Trump to court and winning a lot of suits. Of course, as we've seen even with the foreign aid, that it's unconstitutional for him to cut off all of the foreign aid, and that he needs to start doing it. He's not doing it. So, but I think that was problematic. But what I was biting my lower lip about was in terms of journalism and going back to journalism and the sources that we can find for Gaza and the Middle East. I would add there are actually so many. There's a lot of material on Counterpunch. MondoWise is a terrific source. The Electronic Intifada, a couple of British publications, Middle East Monitor and Middle East Eye, are very good. And sometimes The Guardian has some pretty good stuff about American universities. They've done a very good job. But I'd also like to point out that those sources, they find their documentation on the ground. It comes from Palestinian journalists, and it also comes from aid workers and humanitarian organizations that are established there, like Euromed and other things. And that's where the real documentation of this genocide has come. And that's why the Globe knows it so well, because of those people. On September 1st, global media outlets, over 200 from many, I don't know, over 50 countries, called on September 1st as the day to call out Israel and demand that they stop killing Palestinian journalists in Gaza, and that if they want to get out of the Strip, that countries should take them in, and that also they made another demand that the international press should be able to enter Gaza independently. Of course, now Israel is saying, "Oh, we'll take you on these guided tours, and we'll censor your stories, and that's the only way we'll let you into Gaza." But it's another real point of contention. Only a few outlets here signed on, and I just have to say, NPR signed on and said that they made these demands with. And they were supposed to black out broadcast, both video and audio broadcast, make your front page blank and say, this is a strike until you stop doing this for September 1st. Even though they said they would, they didn't do that. The story that they ran was one of those horrible both sidesing, where all of the Israeli explanations for or rationalizations for justifying their killing of Palestinian journalists, never saying this is about censorship. They ran the story, but in the end, the story just made me crazy by saying that, Well, the Palestinian journalists are just saying that they really don't have any other way to get food, and they're really being paid for this, so that's why they're really reporting. And any piece of literature, any Palestinian journalist you see or see their posts, these people are dedicated to telling the story of their people, to demanding justice, to they're living with them, they're experiencing starvation, they've been displaced numerous times. And for the US media to have ignored that and then continue to write insulting pieces like that is really just outrageous.
Nolan, I wonder if I could turn to you at this point, because you are the Disinfo Detox doc. And my mind inevitably goes back to Judith Miller and Michael Gordon and their role at the New York Times in spreading lies about Iraq. And I always feel a bit ambivalent about Judith Miller because, she's the half-brother of Jimmy Miller, famous record producer, who became a heroin addict when he was producing Exile on Main Street with the crazy Rolling Stones in the 70s. And Judith Miller did write a very evocative and moving piece about having a beloved half-brother who became a junkie and whose life was ruined and who died. But there's no way in which she can engage in that sort of self-reflection when it comes to the millions of people killed and displaced in part because of her journalism. As the Detox Disinfo doc, what's the story in terms of, for example, reaching out to conventional journalists, conventional J schools, conventional education for foreign reporters, foreign policy reporters? Can we prevent the next generation of Thomas Friedmans or Michael Gordons or Judith Millers?
That's a great question, and I obviously hope that we can. But I was very hopeful as a young person shortly after the Iraq War that it was such a naked power grab based on lies that led to murder that there's no way a future generation would fall for this again. I was totally naive, as here we go again. But that was sort of the sentiment of the time. But I always have some hope, to say the least, about some of these folks. But I want to say also for some of the young folks, and I've written a little bit about this, that even if you go to the best top schools and they teach you the best ethics and they drill them in your head, when you get out into the industry, there's less and less jobs and there's a lot of perverse incentives. If you write attention grabbing, nonsensical clickbait, that's how you launch your career. I mean, look at Taylor Lorenz, for God's sakes, or Barry Weiss. If you can fabricate stories, a lot of them will cut corners. Look at Gabriella Miranda a couple years ago, got popped for publishing a bunch. You can go back and look at Stephen Glass and Jason Blair, even a decade or two before. But that's one incentive. Another perverse incentive, though, is that there really is no accountability. I mean, I've followed these people's careers. Like Judith Miller should have been laughed out of journalism 20 plus years ago. Instead, she landed a cush job at Fox News. Chris Cuomo should have been laughed out of journalism after he abused his position to help his brother not only conceal sexual harassment, sexual assault charges, but also the murder of old folks at home. Instead, he landed a cush job at News Nation. You can go down on and on down the list. So there's really no incentive to uphold truth. And those who do, folks who have spoke truth to power, whether it be like an Abby Martin or Matt Taibbi in a different iteration of himself, or Glenn Greenwald, as soon as they annoy the establishment for speaking truth, they get booted out, and they're running around spending their later years trying to record podcasts and write Substacks and pull together revenue from a subscriber base. So I think, as much as I'd like to finger wag a lot of these journalists, I do see the trap they're locked in. And even folks who like Christiane Amanpour, she talked about how she was trying to do somewhat critical reporting of what was going on in Israel, but all of her reporting had to go through the Jerusalem Bureau. And it would not only get edited, it would get delayed. And so a lot of her stuff was thrown out for no longer being quote unquote newsworthy. And so it's just, there's a lot of things stacked against the people in the industry. So I think it needs to go beyond the J schools to actually repairing the industry itself. We need alternatives. And I think what we're learning certainly from the internet era is that the internet was not the alternative. It was another digitized version of the same corporate problems we had in the pre-digital era. Instead of Rupert Murdoch, it's now Spotify amplifying nonsense from like the Joe Rogans of the world, or YouTube amplifying like the Kill Tonys of the world. And sure, any of us can create a podcast. Two of us on here have done it. But without that sort of corporate backing, without the support from the social media companies, all of which are tied to the same establishment power structures, it's very difficult to get your message out. You can be shadow banned, you can be content moderated or whatever. So I think there are good journalists out there doing good work, but to keep speaking truth to power, you really have to ditch the careerism, and probably be much more of a kind of niche reporter to a smaller audience. And even that has its problems with audience capture. I know this morning. I released a Substack critical of the Democratic Party. Of course, I lose like 1,000 subscribers. They don't want to see me criticize the Democratic Party. And if this was Substack was my only living, who knows what that would do to me subconsciously? Would I be like, well, maybe I should not insult the Democrats? So I think I feel like the transformation of the industry is more the problem than the individuals themselves in a lot of cases.
Really great point. And Steve, that draws me on to universities. It used to be the case that we would perorate lectures, keynotes, articles, books by saying, at least in the classroom, we can learn from young minds and we can also give to young minds. We can speak freely, yada, yada. What's happened to the yada, yada?
Well, the past 6 months have been an absolute catastrophe for higher education, and I'm sure your listeners are aware of the fact that, let's just start with funding for basic research. One of the first things the Trump administration did was to start withholding and freezing money that had already been awarded for grants by the NSF, by the NIH. They canceled already 1,600 grants, 1,600 NSF grants. This is leading to we've already started to see the beginning of it, a brain drain out of the United States, especially in the sciences, right? In the EU, there are a number of universities that are offering funds to American researchers who relocate. I just read a piece not too long ago about a couple from University of Wisconsin who are relocating are relocating to Spain because they've been offered money, and it's started as a trickle, but soon it will become a tsunami. Why are they doing this is, I think, an interesting question. Why are they deliberately undermining what was sort of the gem, in the crown of American higher education, our robust funding for basic science? Because they hate. I mean, J.D. Vance has said this openly. They regard universities, colleges and universities, as the enemy. They regard us as being in league with the left, as they regard universities as the province of the left. Exactly. There you go. They think the university is full of people wearing T-shirts like that, that's with pictures of Karl Marx on it, and so they have a policy, an official policy of trying to recapture the institution of the university. So it's begun with defunding and with forcing, especially Ivy League institutions, to pay these, basically pay off the administration, pay these to pay the administration for supposedly not punishing anti-Semitic protesters on their campuses last year. So they've come to a number of Ivy League institutions, Columbia, Harvard, et cetera, have come to, or Columbia and other Ivy League institutions have paid settlements to the Trump administration. But it's going beyond that. They are actively encouraging Republican legislatures to adopt legislation that basically eliminates tenure. It has happened in a number of states around the country where functionally, for example, in the state of Texas, functionally tenure no longer exists because now post-tenure review can be conducted without the involvement of faculty, and somebody can simply be removed by administrative fiat. They've made it very easy to dismiss faculty who might be adopting critical perspectives on Gaza, etc. Here in my area, we have had a number of incidents where academics who have spoken out against Israel's war on Gaza have been disciplined, have been pulled out of the classroom and dismissed. I'm just going to mention two. Stephen Thrasher, professor of journalism at Northwestern University, was involved in a protest last spring where he put himself in between police and student demonstrators who had an encampment protesting the treatment of Israel's treatment of Gaza on campus. At the time, so the police moved him aside. At the time, there were no charges brought against him. But then his name was mentioned in a congressional hearing where a Republican congressman from Indiana asked the then president of Northwestern, "Does this guy still work for you?" And then immediately charges were brought against him. Then he was suspended from the classroom without any kind of academic due process, without any kind of hearing, which is required by the Northwestern faculty handbook. He was suspended with pay, but suspended from all of his classes. Finally, a faculty committee found that his due process rights had been violated. He went back into the classroom, and then he was up for tenure. He was denied tenure. And after you're denied tenure, you're entitled to a terminal year where you get to teach for one more year. They suspended him from the classroom for the entire year. The only reason you can do that, according to Northwestern's handbook and according to the American Association of University Professors recommended institutional regulations, is if the professor poses a threat to students or faculty. But the reason they gave for suspending him is because he was critical of the Northwestern administration. This is at a very prestigious, very wealthy private university. If you can be suspended for criticizing your administration, that is the end of academic freedom. We've seen it. A similar thing happened with a professor at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, who was helping students who were involved in anti-Gaza protests. She was pulled out of her class with 2 weeks left in the semester. 2 weeks left in the semester. She was yanked out of the classroom. Her email account was disabled. Her access to all of her electronic files at the university was disabled. And it was because she was engaged in pro-Palestine activism. At the University of Indiana, and this is the last example I will give, Ben Johnson, a professor of German, gave an example in class when talking about Hegel's ethics, where he referenced the fact that he had been arrested at a solidarity Palestinian solidarity protest. He gave it as an example in a classroom discussion. He was found to have violated Indiana's new intellectual diversity law. Because he was giving this example that some student regarded as biased, and he wasn't giving giving equal time to people who were supporters of Israel in his own class, where he was giving an example as an illustration of a point he was making about Hegel's ethics. He's been subsequently, he went through this whole disciplinary process. He has been formally disciplined for making this one remark that a student found to be objectionable. So I think that the academic freedom is actively under attack, and in some places like Indiana, basically every state which has a Republican legislature, it is hanging by a thread if it hasn't already been extinguished. The AAUP has been fighting this, but they have very limited resources compared to what they're up against. They don't have the resources of the Department of Justice or the Department of Education. They have 50,000 members and the dues from 50,000 members to bring all of these lawsuits. They recently won a lawsuit that they brought on about the suspension of funding for Harvard. The Trump administration had suspended something like $2.5 or $2.6 billion in federal funding for Harvard, and the AAUP brought a lawsuit challenging that, and a federal judge found in their favor just a couple of days ago. But that those are a very few victories. Those victories are few and far between.
And we should say that these university administrators who are doing the dirty on the faculty are not even able to save themselves. The president of Northwestern gone. We've had that happen with Harvard, with Columbia, with Penn, etc. So what is the point of supposedly ensuring that there is diversity of perspective and, to use the language of the day, Jewish students feel safe, when you yourself are actually for the high jump anyway? Robin, I saw that renowned lower lip somewhat mobile again. Nolan is managing to hide his. So I'd like to invite you, Robin, then you, Nolan, to weigh in on it.
So much has been written about Columbia and Harvard and their pushback. Some of the smaller institutions around the country have had some successes. I think some NYU students also recently won a court that their rights were being violated through the institution. So there's been some good points, but I think we can't underestimate it. We really need to emphasize this movement toward the adoption of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, the IRHA definition that turned anti-Semitism into any criticism of Israel. Now, even though actually a pretty good New Yorker article came out about this, even though most of the intellectual community about discrimination does not adopt this and does not believe that this IHRA definition should be used, it's now being used as the political tool. We all pretty much know that Donald Trump does not care about if Jewish students feel safe on a campus. These are actually being used for what Steve just talked about, and that is the dismantling of freedom of speech on U.S. campuses. Nowhere has this been more apparent than what's happened at Columbia, with the deals that they keep trying to make with Trump. But every time they make a deal, they step in and they destroy the university just a little bit more and more. What Rashid Khalidi wrote a letter to the university. He's a long time. He's, I think, worked at Columbia for probably 12 or 15 years, but he's taught Middle Eastern history. He had the Edward Said chair at Columbia, and he wrote a letter to the university and said he was very sorry, but he had to cancel his fall course on the modern history of the Middle East, because even to describe the formation of the state of Israel, you would inherently be criticizing Israel. Even to talk about the 2018 law, for example, of the statehood law, which handed over citizenship only to Israelis and Jews and not to Palestinians, former Palestinians. So creating an apartheid system of occupation, or further moving that whole movement right wing. Even to say that, you would be in violation. So he said, I can't possibly teach this class with any honesty if I do it under these conditions. So the deal that they made in the fall, a few weeks ago, is Columbia actually also made other provisions where the government had access to all staff, employees, documents, and data for compliance purposes, so that they could look at anybody's notes, anybody's anything for compliance purposes. And so the university's own First Amendment Institute at Columbia ruled that just this it was actually such a threat to freedom of speech on Columbia's campus, that it essentially took all the rights to freedom of speech away from faculty and students at Columbia. And it was, their wording was, a regime of intense surveillance that deters and anybody on the campus really from exercising their constitutional rights to freedom of speech. So this is really very serious. And if you think about what Trump has always been about with his conspiracy theories and his hatred of science and anything like that, he abhors anything that's about rational thought, that's critically, that is about you know placing things in a critical dialogue of reason and coherence, and it's part of his chaos agenda, we might also say.
We've got about 5 minutes left. Nolan, I wondered if you might want to comment on this from your perspective as a university professor.
Yeah, I think it's important to remind folks because there's always such a fixation on Trump and the Trump era that Republicans have long had a goal of getting rid of the Department of Education and taking down higher education, and there is an ideological kind of disposition there. I mean, higher education tries and succeeds in a lot of ways to be progressive, which is the antithesis of conservatism, and so I think that tension is almost kind of naturally baked into the cake and at some level. But I also do want to say that I do think conservatives had somewhat of a point. I do think in the neoliberal era, there was much more of a homogeneity of opinion and ideology in higher ed. We made a joke earlier about Toby wearing the Marx shirt, and I think a lot of people think of higher ed in that context, that it's a bunch of Marxists running around. But in reality, the handful of Marxists typically know each other because they're the minority. They're dealing with a lot of corporate neoliberals on campus. You can usually tell because they're the ones who have like the stickers on their door and stuff like that. But it really hasn't become that over the last 30 or so years. The shift to neoliberal managerialism has really gotten rid of Marxism and made it a much more corporatized environment. I've been critical of things like diversity statements, which I think are actually homogeneity statements. They're not actually used to promote diversity, and that goes also with bias. Typically everything has bias, everything has subjectivity at some level. This whole bias reporting from the administration is more CYA. They want to look like they're doing something about problematic bias, but it can be used and is as a weaponized tool against faculty. They, for some reason, empower students who I don't know what training they have to detect problematic bias, but they're supposed to report this bias as the example of what Steve demonstrated. Ditto with, evaluations. I hate this culture of constant evaluations. Like my mechanic the other day was like, evaluate my performance. I'm a college professor. What do I know about being a mechanic? What do I have to say about your performance? But I think the important part that I want to emphasize in saying all that is this is not Trump's doing. Trump would just happen to be in the seat of power when higher ed was at such a weak position. You've got to look back at neoliberal managerialism. You got to look at the faculty who supported this nonsense, including my union, AFT. Recently, the president of the union just signed an agreement to work with the.
I could pick up on what Nolan was talking about bias. Because there's a very interesting example of this, the spread of certain in political culture, the spread of media practices that have been some of the worst, such as both sidesing, and also this charge of bias. Everything is biased if you try actually to tell any kind of truth. So for example, when Amy Sherald pulled her great new art exhibit. She's the one that did the portrait of Michelle Obama. The portrait gallery had the National Portrait Gallery as part of the Smithsonian was going to have her new exhibit, and she pulled it because she included a painting of the Statue of Liberty in trans. It's a fantastic piece of art. But this Smithsonian's attack on DEI led to them not wanting to put the painting up, but to put a videotape there of people talking about the painting. So completely tearing apart her artistic narrative about what America means in terms of identity, an expansive view of identity, putting it into this other very strange media narrative of both sidesing every issue, where well, the Gaza health ministry says this, but the Israelis say that. There's no real truth of anything on the ground. It's always either the Democrats said this or the Democrats said that. There's no real truth in the policy. It's always both sidesing or something is biased. So that's what they attempted to do to this incredible artists who who and now we see these kind of verbal linguistics going into the realm of political art and influencing and kind of, if you will, uh, doing damage in other spheres, that this is now the model that we're supposed to be using, instead of and of course she did it and she pulled the show and everything because of Trump's particular attack on diversity and equality, in all of these different realms. So anyway, I just they said that her trans painting was biased. We don't really think of art narratives or what we make of art or our impressions of art as biased or not. In fact, they're supposed to make us give us an alternative perspective for viewing what is real and what we perceive as real, and that's the whole point of it. But now they're biased.
Well said, Robin. Nolan, you were brutally cut off by the forces of reaction when you were sharing with us your experience with the American Federation of Teachers.
Yeah, the American Federation of Teachers, the president of it, Randy Weingarten, who spent about 3 years in a classroom, she decided to kind of work out this contract with the major AI companies to get educators to collaborate with AI and bringing AI into the classroom. She tried to sell it as, we're going to be on the front lines of shaping AI education. But those of us who are a little more savvy with the market realize that these AI companies want an opportunity to get in the classroom. They want that data on our students. They want that surveillance powers. And of all things, a collective bargaining unit is the one giving it. But I think it's indicative. The reason why I bring up that example, it's indicative of the problems that we did ourselves, those of us in these institutions, whether we're faculty or in these collective bargaining units, or who treated this neoliberal managerial system as if it was normal. We can't go back to that. If you don't want to end up in the situation we're in again, if we have an opportunity to avoid it, you can't go back and do the same thing over and over again. And I think one lesson has to be to faculty is, look, this was obvious, the erosion of tenure jobs to create a gig economy. Steve's over there talking about how some schools no longer have tenure. That was the goal of neoliberalism. They need a couple of tenured faculty members so they can put them in the brochure to sell the illusion of scholarship. But really, they want the whole college experience to be just that, an experience. Swimming pools, nice couches, ping pong tables, stuff administrators understand.
Climbing walls. Don't
Yeah.
forget.
I think I am climbing the walls. The other day I was trying to work out what AI stood for, and I finally worked it out as an acronym. It's GRIFTER. So, to conclude matters, I thought each of us might have a little burst for a minute, say, on the current conjuncture and getting back to my pathetic optimism, resources of hope. Steve.
So, I'll circle back to something I said before, which is I think the turnout of people at demonstrations and protests against what this administration is doing is encouraging. I go just about every weekend to a Tesla takedown protest on the main drag, and my very affluent and sort of used to be homogeneously Republican is now sort of half and half Republican and Democrat suburb, and there are sometimes 100 people out there waving signs that say "No Kings," saying "Deport Musk," things like that. That and the people who drive by that protest, which lines this major road, 2/3 of them honk and cheer. We get the occasional person flipping us the bird or saying F you, but the vast majority of people who drive by are either honking and cheering or just smiling at us as they drive by. That's to me very encouraging, but granted, I'm in a major metropolitan area in a very democratic state, so that might not be representative. I'm sure I would get a different reaction if we were down in Alabama or Georgia.
Robin?
I have a friend who's in Minnesota, and they get a lot of the same reaction. So I don't know if Minnesota is equivalent. I think there's a lot of hope, well, at least for possibly the Democratic Party, because of the win of Zoran Mamdani as the mayoral candidate in the primary of New York City. I think he showed how you run a media campaign that actually speaks to the people. It was at eye level in New York City. They completely reinvented political storytelling. They opened up the dialogue. He went everywhere. He talked to some cops on a podcast. They said, well, at least he was honest. I mean, he was incredible, and he presented the reasons, actual policies that could fix things in a way that was intriguing, and he told the stories in a way that you wanted to get to the end, that you really loved seeing this charismatic candidate, on the streets of New York City talking about this stuff. So it wasn't just, I mean, it was his policies, it was who he was. Absolute turnaround from this Cuomo domination in New York. And he had $20 million. He went up against $20 million that were just pathetic, old fashioned mailings with lying that darkened Mamdani and all of the old stuff. And he showed that to be just yesterday's news and yesterday's way to do it. And that's, to me, it demolished politics as usual and offered us a completely new model, which I think is very hopeful.
And our generous host, Dr. Disinfo Detox, Prof. H.
Yeah, I think I have sort of two things that I've been thinking about. One is that there's been all this big redistricting fight. But the very fact that the Republicans are scrambling to redistrict means that we're actually going to have an election, or they think we're going to have one. So that's a area of hope there. Kind of closely related. The Trump talked a lot about running for a third term, or maybe not having elections at all. Since you started to get some of this reporting about his health concerns, I noticed that messaging has not been amplified as much. Maybe it's a little wishful thinking here, but maybe he knows his days are numbered and a third term isn't possible. Well, actually, I guess according to him, he thinks he's in his third term, but and nonetheless, there's some hope I take from that. But I also want to agree wholeheartedly with both the examples given. If you're someone who's never been to a protest, they can make you feel very energized, especially in this time. There's very dark periods during Trump 2.0, and even like No King's Day really changed my perspective on things. And Mamdani, I obviously I like what he did, but I kept counting him out because I've seen the establishment roll over people like this so much. But this guy keeps finding a way to fight back and turn every attack into a win for himself. So there's something going on in New York, and I think there's a reason to have hope there.
It's handy having a mother who's one of the world's best film directors and a father who's one of the world's best political theorists.
Yeah.
Maybe.
And don't forget his color style, was from Bollywood too. His suits, his light blue and his yellow, marigold yellow.
So, many thanks to Nolan Higdon, our real host, to Robin Andersen, to Steve Masek. It's been wonderful, and I love this idea of bringing together the Disinfo Detox cast and the Cultural Studies cast. So thank you so much to all of you. It was just great seeing you again.
All right. Thank you, Detoxers, for tuning in. Thank you, Toby Miller. Thank you, Robin Andersen. Thank you, Steve Masek. We will see you next time.
Thank you.